Actually, it was a long Russian tradition. It preceded the Bolsheviks. It was the Tsarists were doing it. You destabilize a society by removing its huge segments of the population. You also, by doing population transfers, you change the facts on the ground. So we were arrested, like tens of thousands of other people, and loaded up and shipped off, in our case, to a camp in the Urals, but quite far north, just below the Arctic Circle.
From 1940 to 41, the Soviet Union emptied eastern Poland of up to 1 million people considered hostile to its occupation and used them to create new colonies of forced laborers across Siberia. They were surrounded by death in the camps, but not by fences. If you walked out of the camp, you'd be surrounded by millions of square kilometers of Siberian forest.
It's amazing how news traveled. You know, you'd think that at a time like this, I mean, no phones, certainly never mind cell phones, no phones of any, no landline anywhere, but news traveled. People sent notes and sent things, and people knew that there was a Polish army going to be formed, and it was somewhere in the south. So all the prisoners who could get out headed south.
The Poles were given papers releasing them from thousands of forced labor camps across Siberia. The irony of being liberated is that they were even more vulnerable than inside the camps. Without train tickets, food, money, or support, a wave of starving deportees needed to make their way alone to where the Polish Anders Army was forming, in the southern part of the Soviet Union.
Wanderers upon the face of the earth. Patriots from Poland, nearing the end of one of the most amazing marches in history. 3,000 weary miles they've walked to find a haven of refuge.
While they were recovering in Iran, one of the first things the refugees did was pose for a family photograph. Why would refugees rush to get their picture taken? Maybe to show their families, spread out in other places, that they were alive. But looking at these women and children, maybe it was to prove it to themselves as well. The deportees had no images of Siberia, but these photos, captured in Iran, feel like monuments to what they'd survived. This photo, taken in Tehran, is the earliest image of my grandmother's life. All of their family photographs from Poland had been lost during the deportations. This fraction of a second in Tehran is of a fragmented family in the middle of war. When everything else was gone, memory was the one thing that could only be taken with their lives.
Those are the little houses we lived in. And those little things you see that are doors and things, those are door openings. There is no door, no screen. You can imagine the first night sleeping there. You've just traveled across a plain with all these wild animals, and now you're living in a hut that has no door.
The first modern refugee camps in Africa were for Europeans. 20,000 Polish women and children spread out in 24 villages in 6 African countries. For the Polish children growing up there, what they would later call Africa was less about geography than a shared experience.
There's a wonderful picture of one of the first schools, and the kids are sitting on rocks or something, but they're at school. Schools were that important. They knew that children had to be placed in schools, their education had to begin, their cultural upbringing had to begin, their minds had to be engaged. The children were sort of a national treasure. They had to be looked after because they would go back to a devastated country and rebuild it. The first shock, of course, was that when the war ended, they couldn't go home because Poland had been given to the essentially controlled by Moscow. Very few people who had gone through the gulag had any desire to go back to a country that was ruled essentially by the Soviets, by Russia.
Find inspiration in the splendid example given by the Soviet people.
In the 50s, I actually got introduced to Churchill's multi-volume history of the Second World War. This is when my heart broke, because it was way back then, through Churchill's own writing, that I realized how incredibly badly Poland was treated. It was like a Greek tragedy, because, in a Greek tragedy, you can see the final end coming, and you know that it's irreversible, nothing can stop it. So you sort of saw the betrayal coming, and of course it did. By the time I got to university in the 80s to do my master's, I started hearing very strange things, and I didn't realize how much had happened in terms of the approach to the history of this, because a lot had happened. And I had one Marxist professor, and we were discussing the war, and I mentioned the Soviet Union's invasion of Poland and the deportation of all these people, and he flatly said, the Soviets didn't do that. They never deported anybody. And so, in my innocence, not that I was very young, I was already 40, but I said, but of course they did. My family was deported. They must have been fascists. But it was quite a shock to find out that this is what happened to my history. The damage this did was you had several generations raised and educated in communist Poland who were never taught the truth about their own country. And then you had several generations raised and educated here with the same problem. And so you have this terrible distortion. And I think it plays mind tricks on it. It's not good for our mental health.
Where does your Polishness reside?
I think you've got it, Jonathan, in the memory. But no, memory of what? I never lived in Poland. Never. I was conceived in Poland, but I wasn't born in Poland. I think it resides in my curiosity. I really had to know what happened. And that's why I can never talk about this and only tell my own story. Because no matter what related to my own story, as soon as I became aware of it, I had to find out more about it. So I was constantly going to books and eventually to archives and things and talking to people. I had to know more. My curiosity has driven this, I think, almost since my teen years.